Hi, welcome back to the People's Patriot Project. Today we're discussing mission statements for our three books, um, Through Women's Eyes, the A Patriot's History of the United States, and A People's History of the United States. Before we get into that, I'd like to read a little something. It just so happened that while I was working on this installment, I was also reading Shirley Jackson's The Witchcraft of Salem Village. This is a book that she wrote for kids, maybe around sixth grade. As you may know, a lot of people know her as the writer of The Lottery, but she also had a bunch of kids, and she wrote a bunch of sort of humor pieces along the line of Irma Bombeck, and she also wrote some kids stuff, and this is one of them. And you can see why she'd be interested in this because, like The Lottery, this is also the story of a community sort of gone wild. Why it pertains to us is because there's one phenomenon that I keep seeing in these people's sort of statements of purpose, and also it's part of the motivation for this series, and that's the point where a class identification or even a demographic identification becomes a political tautology. For instance, there are no black Republicans, right? They're all feminists are lesbians. Let's see, all I don't know, all rich people are in the Illuminati, whatever you want to use. Um, and I was reading here about the arrest and trial of Martha Corey, who was one of the women accused of witchcraft. And at this point in the story, and this is based on research, on actual history, the two women who've been accused of witchcraft, one is someone who we would call homeless, and she basically wanders through town with her kids begging for sustenance. And for whatever reason, these devout Puritans aren't particularly compassionate toward her, which is kind of interesting. Um, and then also another woman who's accused is someone who's ill and therefore can't make it to church all that often. And that's a big deal in this community. So both those sort of vulnerable people have been accused. This third woman to be accused, and this is by the girls who are afflicted with some sort of social, subtle encouragement from their community. And here we go, where it talks about her, the accusations against her. It required some courage on the part of the afflicted girls to name Martha Corey because she was neither defenseless nor stupid. She was an elderly, respectable matron who was well thought of in the church, intelligent and well educated for her time. She had stayed away from the first examinations to show her disapproval of what was going on. She had declared frequently that if she did believe in witches, and she was not at all sure that she did, it would not be in witches like poor old Goody Osborne or crazy Sarah Good. This is important because when a class identification, a political identification, a party identification becomes so ossified, so tightly defined, there is no way to bring up objections to any idea or even to further define any idea. If you think that way, then you're not a real X. It seems to me that the point, the value of freedom of speech, of thought, of religion, of intellect is that we are not required to obey the dictates of any cultural group. In other words, our reasoning can be deductive, not inductive. We are not starting with our conclusion and then looking for supporting evidence. We're looking at supporting evidence and then drawing our conclusions. So perhaps one of the reasons I'm doing this project is because I like mysteries. And heaven knows the question of how all of us are going to share the country is at this point as much of a mystery as anything else. So on to the books. Let's start with A People's History, just because that's what I happen to do first. As you recall, we were reading the afterword. And Zinn states that he was encouraged by his wife to write the book, which is kind of interesting. He talks about wanting to fashion a new kind of history and about dealing with the problem of subjectivity. Let's see, he says, by the time I began teaching and writing, I had no illusions about objectivity, if that meant avoiding a point of view. I knew that a historian or journalist or anyone telling a story was forced to choose out of an infinite number of facts what to present, what to omit. And that decision inevitably would reflect, whether consciously or not, the interests of the historian. Okay, I'll agree with that. And then he goes on, but there is no such thing as a pure fact, innocent of interpretation. Behind every fact presented to the world by a teacher, a writer, anyone is a judgment. The judgment that has been made is that this fact is important and that other facts omitted are not important. In other words, framing, right? Whoever frames the question gets to win the debate, right? Again, I agree with him, although I've seen this argument used sort of in an effort to just shut people up. And I would counter that. I think that you can have something close to a pure fact if people agree on what their criteria are. In other words, here are our standards of proof. If we have this much evidence from these sources and we can repeat this experiment X number of times, we can say, as far as we know, most of the time, gravity pulls things down to the earth. Well, you know what? Gravity is an absolute. You get near a black hole and gravity goes cattywampus. But on Earth, most of the time, we can agree about gravity, right? So, this can be slippery, but certainly being aware of bias and presumption and assumptions is important. Then he goes on to get more specific about what he's talking about and what this new kind of history involves. He mentions the issues of class, especially economic class. He talks about how the difference between the interests of the individual and the national interests, that's particularly important to him in terms of warfare. That, in other words, the decisions and the interests of the generals thinking on the part of the country may not match those of the individual soldier. And of course, he's coming from his background of protest against the Vietnam War. In addition to class, which he sees, he's talking about here primarily as economic. He also talks about race. And how non-whites are a patchwork of representation. Yes, Indians were there and then gone. Black people were visible when slaves, then free and invisible. It was a white man's history. And then my note is, yes, and women were so invisible they weren't even in this paragraph. This is important. This is where he's talking about Native Americans. Every American school child learns about the Boston Massacre, but who learns about the massacre of 600 men, women, and children of the Pequot tribe in New England in 1637, or the massacre in the midst of the Civil War of hundreds of Indian families at Sand Creek, Colorado by U.S. soldiers, or the military attack by 200 U.S. cavalrymen in 1870, which wiped out a sleeping camp of Piegan Indians in Montana? And one of the things that I think is going to come through in all of this, that if history isn't comprehensive, it's not history. And the national interest does include everybody. And regardless of your class affiliations or your politics, simply just wanting to know the whole story should be the part of every historian, I would think. I also have a note here that I wonder, I'm not sure, I wonder, but if this massacre may in fact been the source of the name of the ship in Moby Dick. Because, of course, there in Moby Dick, there are all sorts of metaphors and sort of sotto voce discussions of imperialism, of the imperialism of civilization on nature, and the oppression of the whale is sort of a metaphor for the oppression of peoples. So I'm wondering if that may be why the Pequod is called the Pequod. It's spelt differently here, but I suspect they're the same tribe. Um, gosh. He gives another example of forgotten history or avoided history. For instance, in East St. Louis in 1917, there occurred one of the many race riots that took place in what are white-oriented history books called the Progressive Era. There, white workers, angered by the influx of black workers, killed perhaps 200 people, provoking an angry article by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Massacre of East St. Louis, and caused the performing artist Josephine Baker to say, "The very idea of America makes me shake and tremble and gives me nightmares." Zinn goes on to talk about some of his own omissions that have been pointed out to him as a result of earlier editions. Particularly, he doesn't mention gay and lesbian histories. And a larger omission would be that of a greater discussion of Latino peoples. I want to see about that because I see how he handles some of the expansion of the West histories. He may be a little rough on himself here, but then he also does talk about women a little bit more, but most of the examples he gives are very recent and international. So maybe he may be right that he has not been as thorough with American women's history since before independence as perhaps he might have been. But we have a whole other book on that, so that's cool. Let's see, what else? He sort of sums up, yes, we have in this country dominated by corporate wealth and military power and two antiquated political parties, what a fearful conservative characterized as a permanent adversarial culture, challenging the present, demanding a new future. And in here, even in Zinn, I see maybe a bit of a break with some contemporary leftists or people who think of themselves as leftists, where he's saluting the adversarial culture, that it's necessary, it's part of the process. It's something to be celebrated, not avoided. And yet I see in a lot of people who would consider themselves as fans a demand that everybody match, that the discussion is closed, that everything's settled science, etc. Or, who is or isn't on the right side of history, all that sort of stuff that's designed to shut down discussion. It's kind of interesting that, I don't know, I wonder how many people who think of themselves as his fans have actually read him. And that's true for all sorts of things. He closes with a quote from, as he says, the poet Shelley, and I find it interesting that he assumes we all know he means Percy and not Mary. Got to throw that in there, Howard. But he says, he's quoting Shelley, and this is about the women's garment workers in New York. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. It's a wonderful appeal to collectivist action. And that's cool. There's been a lot of good done by collectivist action. But then my question is, what about the individual? Because if you're splitting the world into nationalist concerns and collectivist concerns, what about the individual? And especially, what about the individual who doesn't have a lot of money? But so, that's my Picayune reading of Zinn's Afterword. That was from April 1999. Okay, let's go on to our next book, which will be Through Women's Eyes. And generally, I am pleased with what I've seen here. The overriding theme to me seems to be integrating the class history of women with the overall national history, as opposed to isolating women as if we were a separate species. Let's see, this is from the preface for instructors. Through Women's Eyes in American History with Documents challenges the separation of women's history from what students in our experience think of as real history. We treat all central developments of American history always through women's eyes so that students may experience the broad sweep of the nation's past from a new and illuminating perspective. That echoes what Zinn was saying, but I get more of a feeling that they're not going to be rejecting necessarily the national interest. I hope. We'll see. They talk a bit about the history of women's studies and women's history studies, which goes back to the 30s. I did not know that. The first version of America Through Women's Eyes was written by Mary Ritter Beard in 1933. So, some notes. They will be including some information in the beginning and end of each chapter that we'll probably want to read, even if we're only reading a specific section related to a particular issue. Here's another part from the introduction about how these ideas merge. The concept of gender and the tools of history go together. If we are to move past the notion that what it means to be a woman never changes, we must look to the varying settings in which people assume female and male roles with all of their attendant expectations. Definitions of femininity and masculinity, family structures, what work is considered properly female or male, understandings of motherhood and of marriage, and women's involvement in public affairs all vary tremendously across time, are subject to large forces like economic development and warfare, and can themselves shape the direction of history. As historian Joan Scott forcefully argues, gender can be used as a tool of historical analysis. They talk a little about the separate spheres idea, that women live in a world entirely separate from the male world. In other words, a woman's place is in the home and nowhere else. Moving away from that, and to study women then would mean to be studying only the home, right? Well, they talk about moving toward a more inclusive history, which also includes issues of race and all of that. They speak a little bit here about how they're going to do that integration of the of women's experience with the national story. And let's read it here. Traditionally, American history employed a framework of steady national progress from the colonial revolt against England to modern times. And this is something that we're going to see a bit later in Patriots. From colonial history, colonial revolt against England to modern times. Starting in the 1960s, the writing of American history emphasized an alternative storyline of the struggles of workers, slaves, Indians, and to some degree women, to overcome enduring inequalities. Initially, women's history emphasized the rise and fall of the system of separate gender spheres, the limits of which we suggest above, In organizing through women's eyes, we employ another framework, one that emphasizes three major themes that shaped the diversity of women's lives in American history: work, politics, and family and personal life. So it's going to be interesting. If you look through the special features, there are documents from Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly juxtaposed to each other. I'm going to be watching to see if there's any sort of us versus them assumptions being made, or if all women get to participate in the discussion, even if they're perhaps a bit more conservative than others. Um, because my personal theory is that you get the true story when you put them all together in the blender. And also, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. Let's go on to Patriots, and then I'll make that point. Here we go. Looking at Patriots, I was a little disappointed reading this. I actually met one of the authors, and he seemed like a decent enough guy. And we'll see when we get into the actual work. But there's a lot of anger in the introduction, and also a lot of assumptions. And that's what they claim to be reacting to. For instance, the opening line in the introduction is America's past a tale of racism, sexism, and bigotry? Is it the story of the conquest and rape of a continent? Well, yeah, that's part of it. But then they go, says the answer, of course, is no, 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 no. No, it's not. It's not the only answer. It's not the only thing it's about, but it's certainly part of it. I can give you names, dude. I can show you the graves. So I don't know. So not a good beginning. Here again from the introduction. We remain convinced that if the story of America's past is told fairly, the result cannot be anything but a deepened patriotism, a sense of awe at the obstacles overcome, the passion invested, the blood and tears spilled, and the nation that was built. Maybe. A lot of those blood and tears come from people who were called, 3/5 of a person, who couldn't vote, who were being killed by the people in power. No, so maybe I guess, and well, they go on saying that I'm gonna argue for them here that America's history includes the story of America's victims. Well, then that agrees with the other two books we're reading, but it's a different approach. An honest review, they go on, an honest review of America's past would note, among other observations, that the same founders who owned slaves instituted numerous ways, political and intellectual, to ensure that slavery could not survive. Yes, and then when people fought to end slavery, they fought hook, tooth, and nail to keep slavery going. It's complicated. Time and again, America's leaders have willingly shared power with those who had none, whether they were citizens of territories, former slaves, or disenfranchised women. Okay. It's so the idea, the reality of America as a nation and collection of ideas is greater than the flaws of the individuals who have run it and who have had the most power through the years. Maybe. I don't know if he knows that he's saying that, but I think he might be saying that. He says some nasty things here. For instance, the reason so many academics miss the real history of America is that they assume that ideas don't matter and that there is no such thing as virtue. Give me a break, guys. Come on. It's name calling and stupid. I will agree, though. I think what's happening, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, is that you can choose to emphasize the negative experiences of classes or to emphasize the positive, and also to emphasize the fact that injustice occurred, or you can emphasize the fact that injustice was eventually addressed. It's all real. um, it's not all good, it's not all bad. Is all well that ends well? Maybe, but it hasn't ended yet. Let's see. They talk about the importance of character, individual character, which, let's see, character, and they talk about the building of this system that allows injustice to be addressed, right? Character was tied to a Christian tradition, which is then tied to liberty through a widespread acceptance of common law, and liberty to property, preserved and protected by titles and deeds, and soon by a free market. All four were needed for success, but character was the prerequisite because it put the law behind property agreements and it set responsibility right next to liberty. Okay, that's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to bounce that against Zinn's more collectivist approach. They go on here more about individual character. Throughout much of the 20th century, there was a subtle and at times obvious campaign to separate virtue from talent, to divide character from success. The latest in this line of attack is the emphasis on diversity, that somehow merely having different skin shades or national origins makes America special. But it was not the color of the skin of people who came here that made them special. It was the content of their character. I think he's disagreeing with himself here. You're either saying that America eventually learns how to overcome racial, for instance, injustice, and that's a great thing and to be celebrated, but it's no big deal if the color of people here isn't homogenous. And I don't know. I feel like he's tipping at windmills that aren't really threatening, but I don't think he's articulating himself very well here, because I could actually do a better job of justifying this book, and probably will. Says here, no society is free from corruption. The difference is that in America, corruption is viewed as the exception, not the rule, and when light is shown on it, corruption is viciously attacked. I would add eventually. You have to show a lot of light on corruption to get it attacked. It takes a while. Let's see. It talks about how slavery was abolished because of the dual commitment to liberty and virtue, neither capable of standing without the other. We're going to look at some of the economic factors involved too, but maybe. He's been telling, and if you haven't read the introduction, try to do so, because he talks about the transition between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and how it was hotly contested, and the country was just screaming at each other, but still it was a peaceful transition, and that is an important point. It didn't have to be a coup. Nobody's blood, the blood of Americans versus Americans, wasn't shed at that point. I mean, Adams handed over the keys, and he speaks of Adams being a man of character, and I agree with that. I mean, I know a little bit about him. However, one of the ways these different approaches are different is that I think we're going to see that maybe Zinn is emphasizing the negative, and Schweikart and Allen in Patriots are emphasizing more the positive, the good stuff America does. Not sure what Women's is going to do. It might be both, or there might be a negative emphasis there too, but I don't know. We'll see. However, and I think they're both true. I mean, and speaking of Adams, I mean, he was a man of character who nevertheless functioned in the midst of evil. Adams was functioning in the midst of a country that was doing evils. Not only was slavery going on, we had the lack of universal suffrage, the lack of women's suffrage, and women's suffrage was being discussed along with several other extension of liberties to the entire population. And most people know, they couldn't even, the Continental Congress couldn't even get slavery taken care of. It was, so, moving from that to, which was arguably the hottest primary emergency, the greatest harm being done to people in deeply visceral, personal ways, compared to the lack of suffrage for women. And so, how could you even go on to universal suffrage without, when you can't even get slavery taken care of, as bad as that was? And so, yes, Adam was a man of character, but things that doesn't mean the country was perfect when he was around, and that we should somehow deny one to acknowledge the other, or vice versa. Yeah, America's done many things right, but the truth is, we've been a democracy for less than 100 years. July 4th was 1776 was the birth date of the country, but it wasn't until 1920 that the country finally grew up. And those are both truth. And on that note, our next topic will be women's suffrage, and I'm trying to hone subjects very tightly so that we don't get into 12-hour discussions. But so the topic specifically is going to be the passage of women's suffrage, the actual event when it happened. And I need to go look up the references in the books, and I will come back with our homework for next time. As for what I've been discussing here, sort of piecemeal, please do feel free to react to it, especially if you're familiar with the books and have read, the stuff that we've been talking about. I think that a lot of what I've said here too is a lot of my questions are going to be answered as we go through this project. Okay, here's our homework for next time. I've tried to constrict it as much as possible. You may see other stuff in the indices that you want to read. So, don't think I left stuff out because I'm trying to play games. It's just I'm trying to keep this manageable. For Patriots, we're going to be reading pages 516 and pages 550 through 52. In women's, we're going to be reading pages 469 through 497. That's a lot, but a big chunk of that is a wonderful photo section about the suffrage movement and the various marches on Washington and all of that. It's great stuff. And then in Zinn, we're going to be reading 110 through 114 and 342 through 345. And I will put all of those in the description for this video on YouTube and also on my personal blog entry. Hope to see you all next time. It's going to be interesting to bounce these people off each other. Thanks very much for sticking with me. I'm assuming my approach and style and delivery will get a bit smoother as I get better at this. But we're off. We have started, and see you next time. America, I love you.